Which risks are the absolute ones to really invest in to minimize and keep that as thin as possible?
Welcome to Blitzscaling, a startup. I am Julian Newman.
And I'm Chris Ye.
And Chris, I'm really excited, as I was just saying, about this topic today. And it's something that you know really well, and Reid knows really well. And here we have a clip of Reid talking about it, and maybe understand 50% of what he's saying. And it's so important. So I'm really excited to talk about it. But first, Chris, hello.
Hey, Julian, how are you? It's good to see you. I've been traveling around the world as always. Just got back from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and I'm a little under the weather, so my voice may not be quite at full power. I apologize to all the listeners for that, but hopefully we'll be able to still deliver insights.
I'm sure we will. So let's be super effective and play this clip of Reid. And it's a Q&A from his podcast, Masters of Scale. And somebody's asking him a question essentially about how to manage risk or how to think of risk management for startups. I'll play the full clip and then we can react to it. It's really it's 30 seconds.
Presume that you're not going to be able to make it a purely knowable game. There is some randomness. I have partial risk management, partial control over it, but there's unknown and uncertain things. Which risks are the absolute ones to really invest in to minimize and keep that as thin as possible, right? Which are smart risks to take that if I take them, I can possibly win large? And how am I monitoring if my theory of the game and the theory of the risks I'm taking is working out?
Okay, so that was a clip, and I've heard a lot of this stuff before, so my questions might be a little bit more pointed, but a good starting point would be what can you regurgitate what Reid just said in a slightly more long form manner?
Sure, I'll unpack it a bit. And having spent so much time with Reid, I think I know some of the things he's referring to, although, of course, there is no substitute for the real thing. So the first point is that there is no way to eliminate all risk. Risk is a part of life, and there are things that are unknowable. The unknown unknowns are always going to be there. And so trying to get rid of all risk is a fool's errand. And so what Reid's saying first is, listen, there's no way to eliminate all risk. So what you have to do is be smart about your risk management. Point number one on risk management is to be smart around the existential risks. So this is when he talks about the risks that you have to minimize to make as thin as possible. The point about being in entrepreneurship is that you have to stay in the game. If you are knocked out of the game, that's it. If your company runs out of money and shuts down, you can't come back from that. And so there are existential risks that you have to try to minimize. And the reason you try to minimize them is not because you can eliminate them entirely, but because getting those risks down as thin as possible minimizes the chances that you get knocked out, gives you the most time to have things go right. But then the other thing that Reid points out, which a lot of other people forget, is that it's important to take on intelligent risks that give you bigger upside. So if you are unable to eliminate the risks, if all startups are default dead, if most of the time you're going to fail, the best way to make your risk-adjusted return actually come out ahead is to maximize the return, to make sure that if you win big. And that bigness is what overcomes all the risks that are involved. This is really the principle of blitzscaling. If you think about it, blitzscaling is all about winning a valuable winner-take-most market. Blitzscaling doesn't guarantee success, but it does allow you to make a play for the biggest possible success. So that's why Reid is talking about these different forms of risk. And the final element of it is, as Reid puts it, really understand the theory of the game. So part of Reid's overall philosophy of life is really thinking about things in game theory and game-like terms. And of course, Reid famously loved playing board games and role-playing games when he's growing up, something that he and I have in common, another reason why we get along. And the thing about games is you need to have a theory of the game, even in a game as simple as Monopoly or poker. You have to have a theory of how you win the game. Now, the thing about those kinds of games is that the rules remain relatively static. So you only need to come up with your theory of the game once and then refine it as well as possible. But in the real world, conditions are always changing. And so instead of saying, I'm going to build a theory of the game and then follow that forever, you have to think about how do I need to change this theory over time to account for the changes in the environment around me. And this is where the whole concept of becoming an infinite learner and being willing to unlearn the lessons of the past, being willing to change your theory of the game as the world changes around you becomes so important.
So if I understand it correctly, when we think of this as startup founders, this framework is actually the whole framework for how to build startups and how to execute as a startup founder. So you kind of come up with your theory of the game, and then you decide which risks you want to minimize, which risks you want to be okay with because you think it's worth it, and you execute on minimizing the risks. And over time, you keep on checking in on your theory of the game and on these risks. And if you find, actually, I've tried to minimize this risk and I failed, and that's a big problem, you adjust. And so it's kind of like the meta, like when Reid talks about risk management, it's actually a meta theory for how to build your startup. Is that right?
Yes, because many people think of risk management as minimizing risk, and that's not what Reid means when he says risk management. It's really about managing risk, using risk as a tool to optimize for not necessarily the best average outcome, but the best overall outcome according to your own definition. Right? You could choose to manage risk to deliver the lowest possible beta or variability, or you could manage risk to deliver the highest possible alpha or upside. And obviously, in the case of the venture industry, we are generally focused on maximizing alpha as opposed to minimizing beta.
So what you would do in practice is, and this is something I want to do with you, right, for my next business, which is, let's say what I would want to do with you, right? So I want to sit down with you and say, like, hey, Chris, what is our hypothesis around this business?
Right.
What do we think is, a big risk that we want to minimize? What's a risk we want to learn about? What's a risk we're okay with taking? And have a really, really, really detailed description of all that. And that'll take us time to do together.
Yeah.
I have a lot of the answers in my head, and then talking it through with you will help me. We'll get to something concrete we'll put down on paper. And then every month or every whatever on a recurring basis, you and I would sit down and say, hey, I've been executing, and like, is what we did and what we put down as our theory of the game, our investment thesis, which I think is how Reid would call it.
Yes, we use both
It's
those
still true.
phrases.
Yeah.
No, that's
What
absolutely right.
we're doing, right?
This is one of the things that makes Reid such a great investor because he recognizes that the theory of the game may change. Many investors take this approach where they try to build the theory of the game once and then they want to stick to it and they're disappointed when it changes. And this is reflected in the standard practice of venture capital, which is you go ahead and when you're making the investment, you compose an investment memo that lays out why you think the company is going to be successful and why you should take that risk. And oftentimes you can go onto the internet and see these famous investment memos because, of course, they like to release the investment memos for the companies that are wildly successful. Somehow, I never see those investment memos for the failures. I don't know why. But the point that Reid would make is that it's great that you've put all this work into this investment memo, but don't all of a sudden, as a result, decide that you have to stick to the investment memo. I think that there are times when investors go into a board meeting and they're disappointed because the founder says, well, we thought this, but now we need to do this. And they're vaguely disgruntled, like, oh man, I thought we had that figured out, as opposed to saying, wow, that's great that the founder is proactively updating their theory of the game and updating the investment thesis. So that's why I think Reid understands that this is truly dynamic. It's not like a static thing where you pick an investment memo and you pick an investment thesis and then it just works out. It's something that's constantly going to change.
Okay, super helpful. Now I have some questions about kind of like doing this in like in actuality, a very finely narrow, specific question. So, if I understand correctly, you want to be really aware of all the potential risks, and you won't be, and you want to like get more aware and learn and like add to these risks. But let's say to the extent you can, you want to create a full list of all the risks, right?
Well, let me stop you there.
And
So I think you want to identify the primary risks, but part of knowing that life is ultimately unknowable and that chance and fate play such a key role is not over indexing on outlining every single last risk. Right? Because if you think about it, we could theoretically outline all these risks that are irrelevant, like risk that an asteroid strikes Earth, risk that aliens land, and so on and so forth. What you want to do is you really want to focus on the ones that are really important. And so you're probably not going to have 100 risks that you're managing. You're probably going to keep it down to a top 10 or so.
okay, so you'd say there are 10, let's say 10-ish risks.
Right. And that's a rule of thumb, right? There could be more for your particular company, or there could be like only 3 that matter. But it's just good to give people some guidance so they have an understanding of roughly this seems like it's correct.
So you'd say, let's say the business I'm building, there are 10 risks, and then 10-ish. And then of those risks, there are 2 big buckets. There's the risks that I say, hey, I'm ready to accept this risk, I'm going to monitor it, but I'm not doing anything to de-risk it or to learn more about it, or to like it's just a risk that exists, I'm monitoring. Then there's another bucket, just like here are risks I'm actively working to either learn about or to like make less risky.
Right.
That's right.
That's right. Because this is one of the principles of blitzscaling, let fires burn. You can't spend enough time and energy to put out all the fires. And in this case, some risks are unavoidable or impossible to completely ameliorate.
Okay, so I have, so really, let's call it like 5 risks that you're, well, how many risks in each of those buckets, I guess, is the question.
Who knows, right? It's going to depend on the particular circumstance. But what I will say is the reason I've picked 10 is you want to keep it to a number that you can actually find manageable. Otherwise, your ability to hold them in your head probably will not be sufficient, right? If you are trying to think about a couple of things, then if you try to think about 10 things at once, your brain is going to thrash and grind. You need to be able to focus.
So it's like the way you do to determine which risks you are acting on isn't so much based on it's partially based on the nature of those risks, but it's mostly based on your capacity to execute on managing the risks in real life.
Right, because again, if you're not going to be able to do it, nobody else is, right? You're the entrepreneur. And so you've got to be realistic about what you can actually do and what you can actually affect.
So how do I do to decide which risks go into the active management bucket and which risks go into the monitoring bucket?
So in the active management bucket, it's things that will kill you in the near term. And it's just basically, is this an existential risk? Does this represent a threat to the existence of this company or its ability to win? And those are the things that you're going to really focus on managing. The other kind of risks are risks that you are deliberately accepting because of the upside. And so a big part of that is not just what is the risk, but also what is the upside? Because the biggest risk with those risks is not that those risks are going to take your company down, but rather the upside that you impute to that risk doesn't happen or doesn't look like it's going to happen. So you have to really be monitoring the upside there as opposed to monitoring the risk of it.
Can you give me examples of these different types of risks? So like the risks where there's upside, the risks that there's no upside, and then the risks which I'll let you.
Yeah. So let's talk about a classic example that most people will remember because it's a part of all our lives. So let's take YouTube. YouTube is a fascinating example because there are a series of risks involved, and some of them are pretty dire. So, with YouTube, the primary risk was probably the legal risk. The idea is people are uploading all this stuff, a lot of it's copyrighted. Could we be sued out of existence? There are many people who believe that YouTube would never succeed because it was just a giant machine for copyright and infringement and piracy. But that was a risk that was both existential but needed to be managed. So, one approach to managing this risk would be ban uploads of any copyrighted material. Okay, great. How do you enforce that? It's very difficult, and especially because we're talking about nearly 20 years ago, to be able to have the uploads come in and recognize that they're copyrighted and be able to stop them. And furthermore, if you did have a magical system that prevented anything copyrighted from being uploaded, that would actually be bad because you would no longer have a lot of the content that people are looking for, and you would no longer be the place that people went for online video. So the way that they addressed this risk was as follows. They found a clever way to address it, which is that they established a policy under which if you were a copyright holder, you could report the infringement and have videos taken down. But the real thing there is that there was no way for those copyright holders to accurately enforce. Right? There's no way for them to keep up with the torrent of videos being uploaded all the time. And so as a result, they were able to manage the legal risk associated with the copyrighted material while still deriving the benefit because the vast majority of the material was not reported and continue to attract usage and comments and all those other things.
There's a company, I don't want to, say the name here. There are a bunch of these a few years ago. It was like one-click payment companies. There's one that kind of like flamed out, and I don't. Did you track that? It was in the news a lot.
I tracked it a little bit, not particularly closely, because frankly, I just didn't feel like it was that exciting a space.
Right. So the essentially what happened to all those companies is the biggest risk was that consumers, so like the people who are paying for things on e-commerce sites, would not use it. That was the biggest risk. And what all these businesses did is that they executed on getting a bunch of e-commerce sites to sign up to put the button on, and they deliberately ignored that people would click on the button and actually do it. And they became these giant organizations that raised a ton of capital worth like billions of dollars, and they never dealt with the number one risk. So that would be a risk. I think that would be a risk where there's no upside in taking that risk. Like you should figure out if it's a problem and deal with it before moving forward, right? Like that's the example of that.
Well, let me best understand the risk. The risk was that the payment systems didn't work, or that the consumers wouldn't click on them.
Yeah. So what happened to all those businesses is they all collapsed when they started trying to get consumers to actually do the one-click payments.
The consumers didn't bother. They didn't adopt.
Yeah, they just didn't care.
Yeah. So that is a great example of one of these incredibly large risks that is in fact an existential risk. If the consumers don't adopt, then obviously you're going nowhere. You can have all the partners you want, but the consumers have to make those choices. And the partners certainly aren't going to mandate that the consumer use your payment system, unless, of course, you bribed the retailers, in which case, where the hell are you getting the money from? Because you're already trying to bribe them by saying you're charging less than the existing payment networks, and now you have to pay them even more. It's something that doesn't make sense. So this is something where there was this key risk, and the risk was, will the dogs eat the dog food? Will the consumers actually choose to do this? Will they find greater convenience in it? And it seems like they were managing risk in the wrong way. They were managing one risk, which was get as many retailers as possible to offer this, which was a land grab. But they weren't managing the existential risk of would people actually use this. This is very similar in many ways to the Groupon story, where Groupon was able to use a giant army of salespeople and viral marketing to both sign up tons of merchants and get tons of consumers. but ultimately they never solved the problem of people don't like using Groupon.
Okay, what are examples of risks that you should just ignore, essentially? Like, you should just be like, this might kill us, or I don't know, like, here's a risk that I care about, but I'm doing nothing. Like, why would you do that, and when would you do that?
Well, there are a lot of classic risks, like what if X large company does this instead or comes right after us? And the answer is there's not much you can do about it. You can't control whether or not they're going to come after you. If they do come after you, you can fight, but you don't control necessarily what their behavior is going to be. You can only control your behavior. And so it doesn't make sense to obsess about what the competition is going to do unless it is clear that they're going to do it. So, for example, one of the companies that got a lot of attention recently is Pika. A couple months ago, Pika came out with their text to video product, and they showed the demo, and everyone got very excited about it. And they raised money. And then OpenAI demonstrated Sora, and nobody talks about Pika anymore at all. I think everyone's just like, well, that one's dead. Oh, well. And that's something where the decision to go after that particular market is the decision to accept the risk that the large player will come after it. And the question becomes, was that a good decision or not? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect the answer is no, because what you need to do in a situation where a big player can come after you is to be able to build up enough network effects such that that big player has to buy you or cannot beat you. So this is something that came up for me when I was building Ustream. Many people said, what if YouTube does this? And I said, yeah, what if YouTube does this? That's a great point. And YouTube, in fact, does do this, right? You can do streaming, live streaming on YouTube. We've done it ourselves with this podcast many years later. But my point to folks was, listen, the recorded video world and the live video world are different. The dynamics are different. YouTube cannot optimize for both. Furthermore, YouTube is a part of Google, which is a giant organization that doesn't tend to be able to deliver great new products. And so I'm not going to worry about that. When it arrives, I'll worry about it, but I don't believe it's the sort of existential threat that means I should not even get into the business. Versus the text to video play. It's like, yes, text to video is exciting. I'm sure it's going to be a big market, but how on earth am I going to beat the competitors? Because I don't see what the network effects are going to be. Even if I get an early lead of a couple of months or even 6 months, how am I going to build a barrier to entry that will prevent the big player from just wiping me out?
So let's take Slack, right? Like, what happened to Slack is Microsoft just bundled a Slack equivalent into, and same thing with Zoom, actually, into they just gave it away for free. And, there are a couple of reasons why these, like, Zoom isn't doing well, but this is a big one. And then Slack ended up getting acquired by Salesforce, reasonable amount of money, but it could have been a lot better if Microsoft hadn't done this. So you would say, I think what you'd say is, okay, I'm Stuart Butterfield, I'm running Slack. Microsoft might bundle this, and they actually did. And when it happened, they managed it, and the outcome was suboptimal, but it was fine, and they were right to just ignore that risk upfront.
Correct, because they knew it would take enough time such that they would still be able to build up tremendous value, because once people had adopted Slack, it was difficult for them to leave. And Microsoft Teams basically cut off Slack's growth because all Microsoft shops could just use that instead. By the way, while it has cut off Zoom's growth some, I would say it hasn't done so nearly as much because Microsoft Teams as a meeting piece of software is garbage and terrible. Yeah. I've never met a single person who likes it. And so their market power only extends so far. In both cases, the risk was acceptable because any outcome that ends up with you being a billionaire is generally a good outcome.
Yeah, well, so it's kind of like, at what point do you say, hey, it's too much of a risk that Microsoft will just bundle me into oblivion? Like what would be or there was a time in tech where people did not want to do B2B because they're afraid of Microsoft. So like what's the difference between these two, like today's world where it makes sense but the risk, versus the past where it was too much of a big risk to take?
So the fundamental thing you have to do is to understand how much product value you're adding and how much you're able to create switching costs or moats. So a product that is relatively low added value, Microsoft is just going to take it over. And that's because if it's low added value, then a slightly inferior Microsoft product that is free will beat a slightly superior non Microsoft product that costs money. Because at the end of the day, people are driven by costs, especially the enterprise. So if you want to be a successful B2B competitor, your product has to be significantly better than what Microsoft can do. And you need to build in some sort of switching cost or moat. And the problem with some of these things that we're talking about is there's a lesser switching cost. Ironically enough, I think there's a lesser switching cost for Zoom than for Slack. But Zoom's product is so superior to Microsoft's product that I think it's actually doing better relative to Microsoft than Slack is.
So generally, I think the kind of, in 90% cases, answer is network effect. So it's like, if you are Zoom and everyone's already using Zoom, you have this kind of, I mean, it's kind of weak-ish network effect, but you have
It's
a
a weak
network effect.
it's a weak network effect. I mean, I really with Zoom think it's just the fact that their product is superior. Zoom's engineering is amazing. I tell people this, like I was in Dubai in February and I was using T-Mobile's slow speed internet access, which I get for free. And I could not get Uber to run on my phone. And yet I was able to do a Zoom call, a video Zoom
Yeah,
call, which I was astonished by. And the person said the quality was pretty good. Now, how on earth can a video call require less bandwidth than summoning an Uber? I don't know,
yeah.
but it.
Okay, so in Zoom's case, they are able to deliver superior product because of, technology. And maybe as a startup, you believe that you can do that. I mean, but for most founders, uh, it's actually not reasonable to believe that you can do that. And so, in most cases, the reason you can drive exponentially more value than Microsoft or any incumbent would be your network effects. Most, like,
Most
usually, is
correct.
that
That's right. And you can see Slack has these network effects within organizations. It's rare that an organization is going to fully adopt Slack and then switch to Teams.
right?
It's Microsoft succeeded with their strategy mainly because so many, Slack was still early on the adoption cycle, and people would say, well, you could try this new thing that costs money, or you could try this thing from us that doesn't.
So the thing that Reid is recommending people do is to have a conversation like this, right? Just
Yes,
but about your own business, right? That's what it is.
that's right. And again, it has to be a conversation where you acknowledge that there are some unknowns, right? In all the conversations we've had here, there's not like a bright line that says, yes, this is going to work, or no, this is not going to work. It's all a question of probabilities and tendencies.
And then, like, how do your best portfolio CEOs, or the CEOs that you know of, uh, maybe you don't want to talk about your own portfolio, but how do the best startup CEOs that you know of, how do they keep track of these risks over time? Like, what is the format? What is the mechanism to, you know to keep track of it?
So I don't think there's any one particular way that it's done, right? Probably the most important thing is the brain of the founder themselves. But I would argue that it's better if you actually write it down because then it's a lot easier to share those concerns with the rest of your company. I think that, this can take the form of just a document, or it could take the form of video or what have you. It just depends on whether you're trying to put it down for yourself in order to analyze it or whether you're trying to convey it to others. Personally, I would go with a document. And then you would then be able to revisit the document. You could date it and you could version control it. You could see how you would change it over time. But then when it comes to conveying that message to the rest of the organization, something like a video may be most effective. So I think about, for example, Mark Zuckerberg as being a genius about this. So Mark Zuckerberg is a brilliant, brilliant CEO. Facebook has faced many threats during its time that Mark Zuckerberg would generally be aware of. He wouldn't always be aware of it. Nobody's perfect, but he would generally be aware of it. So, for example, in Facebook's existence, the shift from desktop to mobile was a big deal. And initially, he identified it as an existential risk, something that had to be managed. And then they initially managed it the wrong way. Facebook made the decision that native apps were not going to be a long-term thing, that everything was going to be HTML5, because the logic was HTML5 is a standard platform, and why would people want to install apps when they could just use the browser on their phone and do it just like we do on desktop? But it turns out they were wrong. And so Mark Zuckerberg said, okay, our theory of the case was wrong. Our theory of the game was wrong. Our investment thesis around HTML5 was wrong. And we're going to just abandon that effort, direct all our resources to building a native app. And we're not going to develop any new features until we have our native app done. And if you're going to demonstrate anything to me, you got to demonstrate it to me in the native app form first before you demonstrate it for me on the web. That's the kind of decisive shift that is only possible if you are very clear about what that threat is, what that risk is, and you're very clear about your theory of how to deal with that risk, and you're willing to admit when you've been wrong.
Okay, it sounds to me like managing risk is the CEO's job. And more, so to make that more precise, the CEO's core job is to clearly see the risks and then collaborate with other people in the organization, either people are executing or the board, or also external parties, to like learn about those risks and de-risk those risks, which is just learning mostly. And then the third piece is communicate to the various people who need to be communicated to about those risks and what you're learning and what you're doing in the plan around them. That's the CEO's job.
That's one of the CEO's jobs. Obviously, setting overall strategy, hiring the right people, inspiring the organization, these are all other things. But yes, risk management is not something the CEO can delegate because it is existential. It is a tier one concern, and it is something that CEOs absolutely have to do. And I think that the thing that people underappreciate is the communication of it to others, because it's one thing to be this genius who can foresee and figure things out and pull the right strings. It's another for the pulling of the string to actually be effective. And so your ability to convey the risk that you want to take and the risks that you want to ameliorate and have everyone in the organization thinking that way is one of the keys as well.
So would it be accurate to say that the other things, which are the CEO's jobs, let's say hiring the right people, coming up with strategy, are actually derivative of this, right? So it's kind of like, well, here are the risks. What's the strategy to de-risk them? And who do I need to help me de-risk them? Like actually what you're doing is managing your understanding of the risk. So like this kind of like risk, like the reason Reid talks about this so much is that this is a framework to understand, what CEOs do broadly. Is that right, or is that
I think that's right, but I'll add one other nuance. So risk management is even one level down from the very top level. And the top level is theory of victory, which is how is this going to be successful? How will it change the world? How will it make money? How will it do all of these things? You have to ultimately have that vision, which is why we often say such good things about visionaries. You have to have that vision of victory. And then from that vision of victory, that produces the ability to analyze what are the risks involved, what are the risks we need to take, what are the risks we need to ameliorate. And from that falls strategy and hiring and all those other things. But all those are ultimately in service of the theory of victory.
Right. So it's kind of like my job is to have a theory of victory, learn about my theory of victory, update it, communicate it and do the same thing for the theory of failure, essentially.
Yeah.
And I need to be really clear-eyed and really thoughtful about both of those, and transparent and proactive and blah blah blah.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, like, it's amazing how important this is, and also, like, I honestly, like, I never thought about it in this way or heard people talk about it in this way.
Well, again, I don't want to claim credit for these insights. These are insights I have because of all the time I've spent with Reid taking in his philosophies, which have produced so many $100 billion companies that it's astonishing. And again, I'm just glad that we are able to share these with the entrepreneurs who are looking on, because the world needs great entrepreneurs who understand the way to build these great companies.
Chris, we're done for today. It's been so helpful. Thank you for the time, and thank you to everyone who tuned in, and hopefully you learned as much as I did.
My pleasure, and thank you, everyone. And we'll look forward to talking with you again pretty soon.